The autumn rain had begun early that year in Somerset, turning the country roads into ribbons of mud, and the gardens of Winthor Manor into a tapestry of bronze and gold. Helena Winthor stood at the window of her modest sitting room, watching droplets race down the glass pane, her fingers absently tracing their path. At 26, she had grown accustomed to the quiet rhythm of her life, managing the household accounts, tending to her invalid father, and accepting with resignation that marriage had likely passed her by. The Winthors were gentry, respectable, but not wealthy, their name carrying weight in local society but little else. Helena's mother had died when she was 17, leaving her to shoulder responsibilities that had aged her beyond her years. She had watched her younger sister marry well 2 years prior, had smiled through the wedding breakfast while feeling the weight of her own spinsterhood settling around her shoulders like a familiar shawl. The morning her life changed began like any other. She had risen before dawn to review the week's menu with cook, checked on her father who slept fitfully in his chamber, and settled at her small desk to address the mounting correspondence that accompanied managing a household, however modest. The stack of bills and letters from tradesmen seemed to grow larger each week, a constant reminder of their diminishing resources and her father's declining ability to manage his own affairs. It was Mrs. Pemberton, the housekeeper, who brought the first letter. "Miss Helena, this came with the Morning Post," the older woman said, her weathered face creased with curiosity. "No return address, mind you, just your name." Helena took the cream-colored envelope, noting the fine quality of the paper and the elegant script that spelled out her name. No title, no formality, simply Helena Winthor in black ink that seemed to shimmer in the grey morning light. She turned it over in her hands, finding no seal, no indication of its sender. The weight of the paper suggested expense, the kind of stationery that spoke of wealth and privilege, yet there was nothing ostentatious about it. "Thank you, Mrs. Pemberton," she murmured, dismissing the housekeeper with a gentle nod. Alone again, Helena broke the plain wax seal and unfolded the letter. The handwriting was the same as the envelope, strong, precise, yet somehow gentle in its execution. She began to read. The letter spoke of autumn, of the beauty found in changing seasons and the melancholy that accompanied transformation. It mentioned a walk through falling leaves, the crunch of them underfoot, and how such simple pleasures often went unnoticed in the rush of daily life. The writer confessed to feeling isolated, despite being surrounded by people, to longing for conversation that went beyond pleasantries and social obligation. There was a passage about watching rain fall on ancient stone, about how even weathered surfaces could reveal unexpected beauty when examined closely. The prose was neither flowery nor sparse, but carried a rhythm that suggested someone accustomed to careful thought and precise expression. There was no signature, no name, only a single initial at the bottom, A. Helena read the letter 3 times, searching for clues to the sender's identity. The phrasing suggested education and refinement, yet there was an unusual vulnerability in the words, a raw honesty that seemed almost reckless. Who would write such things to her, and why? She was not a great beauty, possessed no fortune, moved in no circles that would bring her to the attention of someone who could afford such paper and express such thoughts. She found herself returning to the letter throughout the day, between checking on her father and reviewing the household expenditures. The words had awakened something in her, a recognition perhaps of her own isolation. She too felt the weight of performing her daily duties while her inner life remained hidden, unexpressed, unknown even to herself. How many times had she stood at social gatherings, smiling and nodding, while her thoughts drifted to the books waiting in her chamber or the music she longed to play, without fear of being overheard and judged. That evening, as she sat with her father during his waking hours, she found her mind wandering to the letter tucked into her desk drawer. Her father, Sir Geoffrey Winthor, had been a robust man once, full of opinions and energy. Now he drifted between moments of clarity and long stretches of confused rambling, his body failing even as his mind occasionally surfaced with startling lucidity. "You look thoughtful tonight, my dear," he said suddenly, his voice stronger than it had been in days. "Something on your mind?" Helena smoothed the blanket across his lap, considering whether to mention the letter. But what would she say? That a stranger had written to her with words that had stirred something she thought long dormant? "Only the usual household matters, Father," she replied gently. "Nothing to concern yourself with." He studied her with eyes that momentarily held their old sharpness. "You deserve more than this, Helena. More than playing nursemaid to a dying man and managing accounts that never quite balance." The words struck her heart, not because they were unkind, but because they were true, and because her father so rarely acknowledged the sacrifice she had made. Before she could respond, his gaze had drifted away again, his moment of clarity passing like morning mist. 3 days later, another letter arrived. This one spoke of music, of how a melody could capture emotions that words failed to express. The writer described hearing a piano sonata and being moved to tears, then feeling foolish for such a display of sentiment. But perhaps, the letter suggested, there was courage in allowing oneself to feel deeply, even when society demanded restraint. The writer wondered aloud whether Helena knew the piece, Beethoven's Sonata No. 14, the Moonlight Sonata, and whether she had ever felt music reach inside her chest and rearrange something fundamental there. Helena's heart quickened as she read. She knew that piano sonata, had played it herself many times in the privacy of her music room, when the house was quiet, and she could lose herself in the cascading notes. The first movement especially spoke to her, that slow, mournful meditation that seemed to contain all the longing and resignation she felt, but could never voice. Was this connection mere coincidence, or did the writer know something of her habits? Had someone observed her through the music room windows during those early morning sessions when she thought herself alone? The mystery consumed her thoughts. She began to observe the people around her more carefully, the vicar who came to visit her father, the neighbors who called occasionally, even the young solicitor who managed their legal affairs. Could any of them be A? She studied their speech patterns, their turns of phrase, searching for echoes of the letters. The vicar was educated, but spoke in religious platitudes. The solicitor was precise, but cold in his language. The neighbors, kind as they were, possessed neither the depth nor the eloquence of her mysterious correspondent. But nothing matched. The letters continued to arrive, sometimes twice a week, sometimes with longer intervals that left Helena anxiously awaiting the post. Each one revealed more of the writer's inner world. Thoughts on literature, observations about human nature, confessions of loneliness despite social obligations. The writer spoke of attending grand dinners and feeling utterly alone, of wearing masks that society required, of longing for authenticity in a world built on pretense. One letter discussed the weight of expectations, how a life mapped out from birth could feel like a prison with gilded bars. Another explored the nature of duty, questioning whether sacrificing personal happiness for the sake of responsibility was noble or merely cowardly. Helena began to respond in her mind, composing answers to the questions posed, sharing her own thoughts with this invisible correspondent. She wondered if she was developing feelings for someone she had never met, someone who might not even be real. Perhaps this was an elaborate jest, or worse, a cruel game designed to make her look foolish. Yet the letters felt genuine. There was pain in them, and hope, and a tentative reaching out that mirrored her own carefully guarded desires. Against her better judgment, Helena allowed herself to care about the mysterious A, to anticipate each letter like a secret treasure, to feel her world expanding beyond the narrow confines of Winthor Manor. She found herself imagining conversations with him, debates about the books he mentioned, discussions about the philosophical questions he raised. In her mind, he became a companion more real than any she had known in her waking life. One evening in late October, as fog rolled across the Somerset hills and the first frost touched the garden, Helena sat at her writing desk and did something she had resisted for weeks. She wrote back. She addressed her letter to A, though she had no idea where to send it. She spoke honestly about her own isolation, her responsibilities, her fears that life was passing her by while she stood still. She confessed that his letters, for she assumed the writer was male from the handwriting and phrasing, had become precious to her, that they had awakened longings she thought she had successfully buried. She wrote about her love of music, confirming that yes, she knew the Moonlight Sonata intimately, had played it until her fingers knew every note by heart. She wrote about the strange comfort of being truly seen by someone who remained invisible, and the fear that came with that comfort. The next morning she gave the letter to Mrs. Pemberton with simple instructions. "Please see that this reaches the person who has been writing to me." The housekeeper's eyes widened slightly, but she asked no questions. Helena knew the servants were aware of the mysterious correspondence. Little happened in a household without the staff knowing, but Mrs. Pemberton had been with the family too long to gossip. Still, Helena caught the knowing glance between the housekeeper and cook, saw the small smile that played at Mrs. Pemberton's lips as she tucked the letter into her apron pocket. 4 days passed with no response. Helena began to regret her boldness, imagining that her reply had frightened away her mysterious correspondent. She had been too forward, too revealing. She had broken whatever unspoken rules governed their strange connection. Perhaps he had expected her to remain a passive recipient of his thoughts, had not anticipated that she might have thoughts of her own, feelings that matched his in intensity. During those 4 days, Helena's mood darkened perceptibly. She snapped at Cook over a trivial matter, found herself unable to concentrate on the household accounts, and played the piano with such force that Mrs. Pemberton came to check if everything was well. Even her father, in one of his clearer moments, asked why she seemed so troubled. Then, on the 5th day, a letter arrived that made her hands tremble. The writer expressed gratitude for her response, joy at discovering that she had felt the same connection he had hoped for. He apologized for the mystery, explaining that circumstances made normal courtship impossible, that he carried burdens which complicated simple human connection. He wrote that he had never dared hope that someone might understand the isolation he felt, the particular loneliness of being surrounded by people who knew his position but not his person. Her letter had given him something he thought he had lost, hope that genuine connection was still possible. But he wanted her to know, needed her to know, that every word he had written came from genuine feeling, from a heart that had found in her letters a kindred spirit. He spoke of how rare it was to encounter someone who could see beyond surface appearances, who valued authenticity over artifice. He confessed that he looked forward to her letters with an anticipation that bordered on desperate, that the days without word from her felt hollow and grey. He proposed that they continue their correspondence, building a friendship based on honesty rather than social convention. He would reveal himself in time, he promised, when circumstances allowed. Until then, he asked only for patience and trust. He wanted to know her thoughts on everything, what books she read, what music moved her, what dreams she had abandoned, and which ones she still secretly harbored. He wanted to share his own thoughts without the filters that his position normally required. Helena's heart warred with her reason. Every sensible bone in her body warned her that this was foolish, potentially dangerous. She knew nothing concrete about this man beyond what he chose to reveal. He might be married, might be elderly, might be someone entirely unsuitable. Her reputation, already fragile given her age and unmarried status, could be destroyed if this correspondence became known. Yet something deeper, some intuition she had learned to distrust over years of disappointment, told her that this correspondence was perhaps the most real thing in her carefully constructed life. For the first time since her mother's death, she felt truly alive, truly herself. The letters had awakened a part of her she thought had died from disuse, the part that felt deeply, dreamed boldly, hoped recklessly. She wrote back that evening, accepting his terms. Thus began a true correspondence, letters flowing both directions with increasing frequency and intimacy. Helena learned that A was well-educated, well-traveled, and burdened with responsibilities he found suffocating. He spoke of duty and obligation in ways that suggested significant social position, yet he seemed to resent the privileges that came with it. He had been to Italy and France, had seen art that made him question everything he thought he knew about beauty. He read philosophy and poetry with equal enthusiasm, could discuss Wordsworth and Kant with the same depth of understanding. He valued genuineness above all things, had grown weary of the games and pretenses that governed high society. He wrote about attending balls where everyone wore masks of propriety, where conversations followed scripts written by generations of breeding and expectation. He described the exhaustion of constantly performing a role, of measuring every word and gesture against standards of what was appropriate for someone of his station. He longed for simplicity, for the freedom to be merely human rather than a symbol or a title. Helena shared her own story, the loss of her mother, the weight of caring for her father, the loneliness of watching life unfold for others while she remained stationary. She confessed her love of reading, her secret habit of walking alone in the early morning mist when the world was still quiet, and she could pretend for a few precious moments that she was free. She wrote about her fear that she had grown hard and practical from too much responsibility too young, that the romantic girl she had once been had been buried under years of duty and disappointment. She described the peculiar grief of watching her father fade, how she mourned him while he still lived, how guilt and love tangled together until she could not separate them. She confessed her envy of her sister, who had married for love and moved to London, who sent cheerful letters about parties and theatre and all the things Helena would never experience. She admitted to feelings she had never voiced, resentment alongside devotion, frustration alongside patience, dreams alongside resignation. In his letters, A told her she was neither hard nor practical, but strong and admirable. He praised her dedication to her father, her resilience in the face of disappointment. He saw in her sacrifices not resignation, but nobility, and his words made her see herself differently, not as a spinster fading into irrelevance, but as a woman of substance and depth. He wrote that strength was often mistaken for coldness, that those who carried the heaviest burdens were rarely given credit for the weight they bore. The correspondence transformed Helena. She found herself smiling for no apparent reason, humming as she went about her duties. Mrs. Pemberton remarked on the change, noting that Miss Helena seemed lighter somehow, as if a weight had been lifted. The housekeeper took to leaving small vases of flowers in Helena's room, as if celebrating this mysterious renaissance. Even her father, in his lucid moments, commented that she looked happier than she had in years, that there was colour in her cheeks that had been absent for too long. But with the joy came anxiety. Helena knew she was falling in love with someone she had never met, someone who might be entirely different from the man revealed in his letters. She tried to picture him, imagined him as young, then older, handsome, then plain, wealthy, then struggling. But it was his words she loved, his thoughts and feelings, the soul that poured itself onto the page with such naked honesty. She loved the way he saw the world, the questions he asked, the vulnerability he showed. She loved that he trusted her with his doubts and fears, that he saw her as worthy of such confidence. Winter arrived early, bringing with it cold rain and early darkness. Helena's father's health declined further, confining him to his bed for days at a time. The doctor spoke gravely of the coming months, preparing Helena for what she already knew in her heart. She shared her fears with A, finding comfort in his understanding and support. His letters during this time became her lifeline. He wrote of loss and grief, revealing that he too had watched loved ones fade, that he understood the particular helplessness of standing witness to decline. His own mother had died when he was young, and his father had never recovered from the loss, becoming distant and cold until his own death years later. He offered no false comfort, no platitudes, only honest acknowledgement of her pain and steadfast presence through his words. He wrote that grief was love with nowhere to go, that the anticipatory mourning she felt was natural and right. One December evening, as sleet pelted the windows and her father slept fitfully in the room above, Helena received a letter that changed everything. A wrote that the time had come to end their anonymity. He confessed that he had never intended to remain unknown forever, only to establish a connection free from the complications his identity would bring. He had wanted her to know him as a man first, before the weight of his position could colour her perception. He acknowledged the unfairness of this, how he had asked her to trust without offering the same transparency in return. He asked permission to call on her, to reveal himself and begin a courtship proper and public. He acknowledged that she might be disappointed by who he was, that reality might fail to match the image she had constructed. He worried that his identity would change everything between them, that the ease and honesty of their letters might evaporate in the face of social reality. But he could no longer continue in secrecy, could no longer deny his desire to know her not just through letters, but in person. In all the mundane and miraculous ways people truly know one another. He would call on her in 3 days' time, if she consented. He asked her to consider carefully, warned her that his identity might bring complications she had not anticipated. But he hoped, he dared to hope, that the connection they had built through words might survive the transition to reality. Helena sat with the letter in her lap, her heart racing with a mixture of anticipation and terror. Everything would change now. The safe intimacy of their correspondence would give way to the reality of actual acquaintance. She might discover that she had been deceived, or worse, that the man behind the letters was someone she could never truly be with. Physical appearance aside, they might find that the chemistry of written words did not translate to personal interaction. The man she loved through letters might be awkward or cold in person, might not match the voice she had constructed in her imagination. Yet how could she refuse? She had already given her heart to this unknown correspondent. Whatever came next, she had to face it. To refuse would be cowardice, would mean living forever with the question of what might have been. She wrote her consent that night, her hand shaking as she sealed the envelope. She added only one request, that he come in the afternoon when her father was most likely to be sleeping peacefully, when she could meet him without distraction or interruption. The next 3 days passed in a blur of anxious preparation and second-guessing. Helena changed her dress 4 times on the appointed day, settling finally on a simple gown of dove grey that Mrs. Pemberton insisted brought out the colour of her eyes. She arranged her dark hair in a softer style than usual, then undid it and arranged it again, fearing she was trying too hard to impress. She wanted to look her best, but not desperate, elegant, but not pretentious. Mrs. Pemberton, sensing her nervousness, brought tea and spoke gently. "Whoever this gentleman is, Miss Helena, he'd be a fool not to see what a remarkable woman you are." The simple kindness nearly undid her composure. Helena blinked back sudden tears, squeezed the older woman's hand in gratitude. When the knock finally came at the door, Helena felt her breath catch in her throat. She heard the sound of hooves and wheels outside, a carriage, and from the sound of it, an expensive one. Her anxiety intensified. Mrs. Pemberton showed the visitor into the drawing room, and Helena heard the housekeeper's sharp intake of breath, followed by an unusually deferential tone that bordered on awe. Her anxiety intensified. Who had come that would make their unflappable housekeeper react so? Helena smoothed her skirt, lifted her chin, and walked into the drawing room with as much composure as she could muster. The man who stood by the window, his back to her as he gazed out at the winter bare garden, was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed with elegant simplicity in dark wool that spoke of expensive tailoring. When he turned to face her, Helena felt the world tilt slightly. She knew him, not personally, they had never been introduced, but she knew his face from the newspapers and society gossip that even reached quiet Somerset. The strong features, the grey eyes that seemed to hold both warmth and sorrow, the distinctive scar along his jaw from a riding accident years ago that had been reported in detail by the scandal sheets. Albert Fairley, the Duke of Harrington. Helena's hand flew to her throat, her mind reeling. This man, this impossibly prominent, powerful man, was A? The Duke of Harrington had been writing her letters, pouring out his soul to her, a country gentleman's daughter of modest means and no particular importance. This man, who could have his choice of the most beautiful, wealthy, accomplished women in England, had chosen instead to court her through anonymous letters. It made no sense. It was impossible. Yet here he stood, holding himself with visible tension, his hands clasped behind his back, his eyes searching her face with an expression that held both hope and fear. He looked exactly as she might have imagined, handsome in a way that was striking rather than pretty, with lines around his eyes that suggested both laughter and worry. But more than that, he looked vulnerable, uncertain, almost afraid. "Miss Winther," he said, his voice matching the one she had imagined during countless readings of his letters, deep, cultured, but with an underlying vulnerability that no title could mask. "I am Albert Fairley. I believe we have been corresponding." Helena found herself unable to speak, her thoughts a chaotic tangle of shock, confusion, and an emotion she could not quite name. The Duke took a step toward her, then stopped, as if uncertain of his welcome. "I know this is a shock," he continued, his words coming faster now, as if he needed to explain before she could reject him. "I know you must think me duplicitous, perhaps even cruel, for hiding my identity, but I swear to you, everything I wrote was true. Every feeling, every thought. I only wanted you to know me as Albert, not as the Duke of Harrington. I wanted—" Helena stood frozen in her drawing room, the world suddenly too small to contain the revelation before her. Albert Fairley, the Duke of Harrington, one of the most powerful men in England, watched her with an expression that held such raw vulnerability that it cut through her shock like a blade. His grey eyes, which she had seen rendered in newspaper illustrations, were more vivid in person, carrying depths of emotion that no artist could capture. "I needed you to know me," he said quietly, his hands now clenched at his sides, as if to prevent himself from reaching for her. "Not the Duke, not the title, not the estates or the political influence or any of the things that define me in society. Just me, just Albert, the man who finds solace in music and poetry, who feels too much in a world that demands he feel nothing at all." The name sounded strange coming from his lips, too intimate, too human for a man whose very title commanded respect and deference. Helena's mind raced backward through every letter, re-examining his words through this new lens. The burden of responsibility he had mentioned, the suffocating weight of duty, the loneliness despite constant company, the grand dinners where he felt utterly alone, all of it suddenly made terrible, perfect sense. He had not been speaking metaphorically. He had been describing his actual life as one of the most prominent peers in England. "Your Grace," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, but he flinched as if she had struck him. "Please," he said, and there was something almost desperate in his tone. "Please don't, not yet. Let me explain before you retreat behind formality, before everything changes between us, because you know who I am." Helena nodded mutely, gesturing to the chairs near the fireplace. Her legs felt unsteady, and she suspected his did as well, though he moved with the practiced grace of someone trained from birth to hide weakness. They sat, a careful distance between them, the air thick with tension and unspoken words. The Duke leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped together. "I first saw you nearly 6 months ago," he began. "I was visiting the Ashworths. You may know them. They have an estate about 10 miles from here. I had ridden out alone one morning, trying to escape the tedium of yet another house party, and I came upon you, walking near the old bridge over the stream." Helena remembered that morning. She had risen before dawn, unable to sleep, and had walked farther than usual in the pre-dawn mist. She had thought herself alone, had allowed herself to cry freely for the first time in months, overwhelmed by the weight of her father's illness and her own loneliness. "You were crying," he continued softly, "but then you stopped, wiped your tears, straightened your shoulders, and continued walking with such determined grace that it took my breath away. I stayed hidden, not wanting to intrude on your privacy, but I was struck by you, by your strength, by the way you allowed yourself to feel deeply and then chose to carry on regardless." "I had no idea," Helena whispered, feeling exposed and unsettled that someone had witnessed such a private moment. "I made inquiries, discreet ones, about who you were. I learned about your father, about your family circumstances, about how you had devoted yourself to caring for him. I learned that you were admired locally for your kindness and integrity, that you managed your household with quiet competence, that you were considered bookish and perhaps a bit too independent for your own good." A small smile touched his lips. "The last part intrigued me most." He stood abruptly, unable to remain still, and moved to the window. Helena watched him, this powerful man, who suddenly seemed as uncertain as she felt. The winter light caught the silver threads in his dark hair. He was perhaps 35, she estimated, 9 years her senior. "I wanted to meet you properly," he continued, "but how could I? How could the Duke of Harrington call upon the unmarried daughter of a country squire without creating a scandal, without raising expectations, without bringing the weight of society's attention crushing down upon you? Any association with me would change your life irrevocably. You would be scrutinized, gossiped about, judged by standards you never asked to meet." He turned back to face her, his expression earnest. "And more than that, I knew that if I came to you as the Duke, you would never truly know me. You would see the title first, would respond to my position rather than my person. Every word you spoke would be filtered through awareness of who I am, what I represent. I've lived my entire life with people who want something from me. Access, influence, connection, money. I've never known if anyone truly cared about me as a man, separate from everything I could provide. Helena's initial shock was beginning to recede, replaced by a growing understanding. She thought of the letters, of the raw honesty they contained, of how vulnerable he had made himself. A duke could not write such things to anyone, could not confess loneliness and doubt and fear. But Albert, just Albert hiding behind an initial, could. "So you created a fiction," she said slowly. "You gave me a version of yourself that was true in spirit, but false in fact." "Yes," he admitted, his jaw tightening. "And I know how that must seem to you. Dishonest, manipulative, perhaps cruel, but Helena—" He stopped, seeming to realize he had used her given name without permission, then continued anyway. "Helena, every word I wrote to you came from my heart. Every thought, every feeling, every confession, all of it was real. More real than anything I've shared with anyone else in my life. In those letters, I was more honest than I've ever been, because I didn't have to be the Duke. I could just be a man hoping to connect with a woman who seemed to understand the weight of duty and isolation." Helena rose from her chair, needing to move, to process this revelation. She walked to the opposite window, putting distance between them, trying to organize her whirling thoughts. Outside, the December afternoon was growing darker, clouds gathering for what looked like more rain or perhaps snow. "You say you wanted me to know you," she said finally, not looking at him. "But you only showed me what you chose to show me. You knew everything about me, my circumstances, my family, my habits. You watched me without my knowledge. You investigated me. While I knew nothing true about you except what you crafted in your letters, how is that knowing someone? How is that honest?" The words came out sharper than she intended, but she felt a spark of anger cutting through her confusion. He had given her the illusion of equality while holding all the power, all the knowledge, all the control. "You're right," he said simply. "You're absolutely right. And I have no defense except to say that I didn't know how else to approach you. I didn't know how to bridge the enormous gulf that exists between your world and mine without using the only tool I had, words on a page, stripped of context and title." Helena turned to face him. "And what did you imagine would happen when you finally revealed yourself? That I would be so flattered by a duke's attention, that I would overlook the deception, that I would be grateful for the honor of your interest, regardless of how you obtained it?" Something flashed in his eyes, pain perhaps, or recognition of his own arrogance. "No," he said quietly. "I imagined exactly this. Your anger, your sense of betrayal. I knew I was being selfish, pursuing my own desire for authentic connection, without considering fully how my methods might harm you. I told myself I would reveal the truth in time, that I would give you the choice to continue or end our correspondence once you knew who I was. But the truth is I was also a coward. I was afraid that if you knew from the beginning, you would never allow yourself to be honest with me, would never share yourself as freely as you did." He moved closer, though still maintaining a respectful distance. "I don't expect you to forgive me immediately or perhaps ever, but I needed you to understand that my feelings are real. The man who wrote those letters is who I truly am, beneath the title and expectations. And the woman who wrote back to me, thoughtful, passionate, brave enough to be vulnerable, she is who I fell in love with." The last words seemed to hang in the air between them, more shocking in some ways than his title. Helena's breath caught. Love. He had written the word in his letters, hinted at it, circled around it, but hearing him speak it aloud, seeing the intensity in his eyes as he said it, made it terrifyingly real. "You don't know me," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "You don't know if the woman in the letters matches the woman standing before you." "Don't I?" he challenged gently. "I know your strength and your compassion. I know the way your mind works, how you question and analyze and refuse to accept easy answers. I know your love of music and literature, your sense of duty, your capacity for deep feeling that you try to hide beneath practicality. I know that you walk alone in the early morning mist, because it's the only time you allow yourself to simply be without the weight of responsibility. I know that you play the Moonlight Sonata when you're sad, Chopin when you're restless, and Mozart when you're trying to convince yourself that joy still exists in the world. Helena felt tears prick her eyes. He did know her, knew her in ways that no one else ever had, in ways she had barely admitted to herself. The letters had been a kind of truth, even if the identity behind them had been obscured. "What do you want from me?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "I want the chance to court you properly," he said. "Not as the Duke visiting a country family, but as a man who has found someone he believes he could love for the rest of his life. I want to know if what we built through letters can survive in the real world, with all its complications and demands. I want to discover if the connection we forged can weather the storm of society's judgment, my responsibilities, the vast difference in our circumstances." "And if it can't?" Helena asked. "If reality proves too different from the fantasy we created, then at least we'll know," he said. "At least we'll have tried. But Helena, I believe it can. I believe that what we have is rare and worth fighting for. I've spent my entire life meeting expectations, fulfilling duties, doing what was required of me. For once, just once, I want to choose something for myself, and I choose you." The simple declaration, spoken with such quiet intensity, finally broke through Helena's defenses. She felt the tears spill over, felt the confusion and anger and hope and fear all tangling together, until she couldn't separate them. "I don't know if I can trust you," she admitted. "You've already deceived me once. How do I know you won't do it again?" "You can't," he said honestly. "Trust isn't something I can demand or prove in a moment. It has to be earned over time through consistency and honesty. All I can offer is my commitment to try, to be as transparent as my position allows, to give you the truth even when it's difficult or unflattering." He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a folded paper. "This is a letter I wrote last night, knowing I would see you today. It contains information I've never shared with anyone, about my childhood, my relationship with my late father, the burdens that come with my title, the loneliness that has defined most of my adult life. Things that are deeply personal and potentially damaging if they became public. I'm giving it to you as a gesture of trust, as proof that I'm willing to be vulnerable with you, to give you power that I've never given anyone else." Helena took the letter with trembling hands but didn't open it. Instead, she looked at him, really looked at him, seeing past the title and the elegant clothes to the man beneath. He looked tired, she realized, and anxious and hopeful in a way that made him seem younger than his years. "I need time," she said finally. "Time to think, to process all of this. Time to reconcile the man I thought I knew with the reality of who you are." "Of course," he said immediately. "Take all the time you need. I'll stay at the Ashworth's estate for the next week. You can send word if, when, you're ready to speak again." He moved toward the door, then paused. "Helena, regardless of what you decide, I want you to know that our correspondence was the most genuine thing in my life. You gave me a gift these past months, the gift of being seen and understood. Whatever happens, I'll always be grateful for that." After he left, Helena stood in her drawing room for a long time, holding the unopened letter, listening to the sound of his carriage disappearing down the lane. "Mrs." Pemberton appeared in the doorway, her face full of questions, but Helena shook her head. "Not now," she whispered. "Please, not now." She went to her room and sat at her desk, finally opening the letter he had given her. What she read there, confessions about a lonely childhood, the crushing weight of inheriting his title at 21 when his father died, the pressure to marry appropriately and produce an heir, the emptiness of relationships built on advantage rather than affection, moved her deeply. He wrote about watching his parents' cold, formal marriage and vowing never to replicate it, about the growing desperation he felt as he approached 40 without finding genuine connection. He wrote about the moment he saw her by the bridge and thought, finally someone who understands what it means to carry on, despite the weight. Over the next 3 days, Helena wrestled with her feelings. She reread all his letters, seeing them now through the lens of his identity, understanding references she had missed before, She thought about what a life with him might mean, the scrutiny, the expectations, the vast gulf between their stations that society would never let them forget. She thought about the alternative, returning to her quiet existence, letting this chance slip away, wondering forever what might have been. She also acknowledged, in the privacy of her own heart, that she had fallen in love with him. Not with the Duke of Harrington, but with Albert, the man who wrote beautiful letters and understood loneliness and valued authenticity above propriety. The question wasn't whether she had feelings for him, it was whether those feelings were strong enough to face what would come. On the fourth day, she sent word that he could call again. This time, when he entered her drawing room, the initial shock had worn off. Helena could see him more clearly now, not just as a duke or as her mysterious correspondent, but as a complex man trying to navigate impossible circumstances. He looked less certain than before, as if her summons might be a rejection rather than an invitation. "Thank you for seeing me," he said formally, then seemed to catch himself. "I promised honesty. The truth is, I've barely slept since I left here. I've been terrified that I've ruined everything, that my deception destroyed whatever we built together." "Sit down, Albert," Helena said, using his name deliberately. She saw the flicker of hope in his eyes at the familiarity. "We need to talk about what happens next." He sat, leaning forward attentively. "I'm listening." "I've thought about everything you said," Helena began carefully, "and I've realized that I'm angry with you, but I also understand why you did what you did. I don't condone the deception, but I comprehend the reasoning behind it. More importantly, I've realized that the connection we forged through letters feels more real to me than most relationships built on traditional courtship." She took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "But I need you to understand what you're asking of me. If we pursue this, my life will change irrevocably. I will be scrutinized by a society that already views me as too old, too unmarried, too unremarkable to warrant a duke's attention. People will say terrible things. They'll question your judgment and my character. They'll assume I'm a fortune hunter or worse." "I know," he said quietly, "and I won't lie to you. It will be difficult. But Helena, you're not unremarkable. You're extraordinary in ways that have nothing to do with birth or fortune, and anyone who takes the time to know you will see that." "Will they?" she asked. "Or will they only see what they expect to see? A duke making a foolish match, lowering himself for some incomprehensible reason?" Albert stood and came to kneel before her chair, taking her hands in his. The gesture was presumptuous, intimate, but Helena didn't pull away. "Let them think what they like," he said fiercely. "I've spent my entire life caring what society thinks, molding myself to meet their expectations. I'm done. I'm choosing my own happiness, my own future, and I'm choosing you if you'll have me." Helena looked down at their joined hands, his larger, stronger, but holding hers with surprising gentleness. She thought about her father upstairs, declining rapidly, about how short life could be, how opportunities might never come again. She thought about the woman she had become through their correspondence, braver, more hopeful, more willing to feel deeply despite the risk of pain. "I'm choosing you too," she said softly. "Not because you're a duke, but despite it. I'm choosing the man who writes about music and loneliness and the courage it takes to feel deeply. I'm choosing to trust that the person I came to know through letters is real, even if circumstances forced you to hide his identity." The smile that transformed his face was radiant, unguarded, making him look years younger. He raised her hands to his lips, kissing her knuckles with reverence. "You won't regret this," he promised. "I'll spend the rest of my life making sure you don't regret this." "Don't make promises you can't keep," Helena said, but she was smiling too. "Just be honest with me. That's all I ask." They spent the rest of that afternoon talking, really talking, without the filter of written correspondence. He told her about his estates, his responsibilities in Parliament, the various charitable endeavours he supported. She told him about her father's worsening condition, her worries about what would happen when he passed, her dreams of travelling and seeing the places she had only read about in books. When he finally left, it was with the understanding that he would return the next day, and the day after that, beginning a proper courtship that they both knew would scandalously short. Neither of them was young enough to afford lengthy engagements, and both had waited too long already for this kind of connection. Over the following weeks, Albert became a regular presence at Winthor Manor. He came to know her father during his lucid moments, earning the old man's respect with his genuine interest and lack of condescension. He played chess with Sir Geoffrey, discussing politics and local matters as equals rather than as a great lord indulging a lesser man. He also revealed more of himself to Helena, not just the polished exterior he showed the world, but the doubts and fears and hopes he had shared in his letters. They took walks together, always properly chaperoned by Mrs. Pemberton, but managing to create pockets of privacy for real conversation. They discovered that the connection forged through correspondence translated well to personal interaction, that they could talk for hours without running out of things to say. But it wasn't all easy. News of the Duke of Harrington's frequent visits to Winthor Manor spread quickly through local society. Invitations began arriving for Helena from families who had never noticed her before, transparently hoping to curry favor with the Duke through association with her. Some were kind, genuinely welcoming her into circles that had previously excluded her. Others were cruel, making thinly veiled comments about ambition and social climbing. Albert's world began intruding on her quiet life in other ways too. His secretary arrived one day with legal documents, his housekeeper came to discuss staffing arrangements, and a dressmaker from London appeared with fabrics and designs, insisting that the future Duchess of Harrington must be properly attired. Helena found it overwhelming, the sudden rush of attention and expectation after years of being overlooked. One evening, after a particularly difficult day in which she had been snubbed by a neighbor who had previously been friendly, Helena broke down in tears. Albert found her in the music room, sitting at the piano but not playing, her shoulders shaking with suppressed sobs. "What have I done?" she whispered when he sat beside her on the bench. "I've lost my anonymity, my quiet life. People who were kind to me now resent me, and people who ignored me now seek my attention for all the wrong reasons. I don't know who I can trust anymore." Albert put his arm around her, drawing her close. "I know," he said gently. "I'm sorry. I knew this would be difficult, but knowing and experiencing are different things. But Helena, it does get better. Eventually, people accept the reality and move on to other scandals, and you'll find your true friends, the ones who value you for who you are, not for your connection to me." "How do you bear it?" she asked. "This constant scrutiny, this performance." "By remembering what matters," he said. "By holding on to the people and things that are real and letting the rest fade into background noise. You'll learn. I'll help you learn." She turned to face him, seeing in his eyes the same vulnerability he had shown in his letters. "I'm afraid," she admitted. "Afraid I'm not strong enough for this, not graceful enough, not clever enough to navigate your world." "You're all of those things and more," he said firmly. "You're the strongest person I know, Helena. You've survived losses and responsibilities that would have broken lesser people. You'll survive this too, and you won't be alone. I'll be with you every step of the way." He kissed her then, gently at first, then with growing passion as she responded. It was their first real kiss, and it felt like a promise, a sealing of the commitment they had made to each other. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless, Helena felt steadier. "Play for me," Albert requested softly. "Play the Moonlight Sonata." Helena's fingers found the keys, and the familiar opening notes filled the room. But this time, she wasn't playing alone in the pre-dawn hours, hiding her emotions from the world. She was playing for someone who understood, who heard not just the notes, but the feeling behind them. Albert sat beside her, his hand on her back offering silent support and presence. As the sonata built to its powerful conclusion, Helena realized that this was what she had been searching for without knowing it. Not rescue or romance in the conventional sense, but partnership. Someone to share the weight, to understand the complexity, to see her fully, and choose her anyway. The road ahead would be difficult, but perhaps it would also be beautiful in ways she couldn't yet imagine. When the last note faded, Albert took her hand again. "Marry me," he said. "Not because I'm a duke and you should feel honored, but because I love you and cannot imagine my life without you in it. Marry me and let us build something real together. something that belongs to us alone, regardless of titles and expectations. Helena looked at him, this man who had been both stranger and intimate friend, deceiver and honest confessor, Duke and simply Albert. She thought about the letters that had started everything, about the risk of loving someone, about the choice between safety and possibility. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I'll marry you." The announcement of their engagement appeared in the Times 3 weeks later, causing exactly the sensation Albert had predicted. Some sections of society were scandalized, others intrigued, and still others dismissive of what they saw as an eccentric duke's peculiar choice. Helena read the speculation and gossip with a mixture of amusement and discomfort, trying to follow Albert's advice to let it become background noise. But what she hadn't anticipated was the flood of correspondence that followed. Letters arrived daily, some congratulatory, others calculating, and a few genuinely kind. There were invitations to balls and dinners, requests for patronage, and dozens of calls from people hoping to establish connection with the future Duchess. Helena found herself overwhelmed by the sudden attention, by the transformation from invisible spinster to sought-after society figure. Her father's health continued to decline, adding an undercurrent of sorrow to what should have been a joyful time. Sir Geoffrey had moments of clarity where he expressed happiness about Helena's engagement, but these grew increasingly rare. The doctor warned that it was only a matter of time, perhaps weeks, rather than months. Helena divided her days between preparing for her new life and sitting with her father, reading to him, holding his hand, saying goodbye in gradual increments. Albert proved to be exactly the partner she needed during this difficult time. He didn't press for elaborate wedding plans or insist that she prioritize social obligations over her father's care. Instead, he adjusted his own schedule to be present, to offer support, to simply sit with her in the quiet moments when grief felt overwhelming. He brought books to read aloud when Sir Geoffrey was awake, discussed estate management during lucid moments, and treated the dying man with respect rather than pity. One grey February afternoon, as sleet rattled against the windows of her father's chamber, Sir Geoffrey opened his eyes with unusual clarity. He looked at Helena, then at Albert, who sat quietly in the corner, and smiled weakly. "You chose well, daughter," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the sound of rain. "He sees you truly. That's rare, rarer than you know." "Rest, father," Helena said gently, though tears threatened. "Save your strength." "For what?" he asked with a ghost of his old humor. "No, let me say this while I can. You've been dutiful to a fault, Helena. You sacrificed your youth to care for me, and I've never adequately thanked you. I watched you turn down invitations, decline opportunities, put your life on hold for mine. It broke my heart, even as I selfishly accepted it." "I chose it willingly," Helena protested, but her father shook his head weakly. "Perhaps. But now it's time for you to live. Promise me you'll be selfish sometimes, that you'll choose happiness when it's offered, that you won't let duty consume you the way it consumed me. I spent so much of my life doing what was expected rather than what I desired, and I see now what I missed. Don't make my mistakes." "I promise," Helena whispered, her voice breaking as she clutched his frail hand. Sir Geoffrey's gaze shifted to Albert. "And you, Your Grace. You've chosen a woman of substance and strength. Don't waste that. Don't let society or position diminish what you've found together. My wife, Helena's mother, was like that. Remarkable. I didn't appreciate her enough while I had her. Learn from my regret." "I won't, sir," Albert said solemnly, moving to stand beside Helena. "You have my word. I know exactly how fortunate I am." The old man nodded, satisfied, his eyes already drifting closed. "Good, that's good. Take care of my daughter. She deserves joy." He drifted back to sleep, his breathing shallow and labored. 3 days later, surrounded by his daughter and the man she would marry, Sir Geoffrey Winthorpe passed peacefully in the early morning hours, just as dawn was breaking over the Somerset hills he had loved. The grief was profound, but not unexpected. Helena mourned her father while simultaneously feeling a guilty sense of relief that his suffering had ended, that he was finally at peace. She sat in his empty chamber the day after his death, surrounded by his belongings, and wept not just for his loss but for all the conversations they had never had, the affection he had rarely expressed, the years of quiet coexistence that had stood in for deeper connection. Albert found her there and simply held her, saying nothing because there was nothing to say. His presence was enough, solid and steady and unconditionally supportive. When she finally exhausted her tears, he helped her stand, guided her to eat something, ensured she rested. He handled all the funeral arrangements, shielding Helena from the details and logistics, while ensuring her father received the dignified farewell he deserved. The funeral drew a surprisingly large crowd. Sir Geoffrey had been respected in the community, and many came to pay their respects. But Helena knew that some attended out of curiosity, wanting to observe the future Duchess in her grief, to see if she would falter under the weight of loss and scrutiny. She felt their eyes on her throughout the service, measuring, judging, cataloguing every tear and tremor. But she also felt Albert's steady presence beside her, his hand occasionally brushing hers in silent support. She saw genuine grief on Mrs. Pemberton's face, heard the sincere condolences from neighbors who had known her father for decades, and she realized that the watchers didn't matter, only the people who truly cared, truly mourned, truly understood. The period of mourning meant postponing the wedding, which actually came as a relief to Helena. She needed time to grieve, to adjust to her father's absence, to settle his affairs and decide what to do with Windsor Manor. She needed time to prepare mentally and emotionally for the massive changes coming. Albert agreed without hesitation, willing to wait however long she needed, content to continue their courtship through this difficult period. During those quiet months of mourning, their relationship deepened in unexpected ways. Stripped of social obligations and wedding preparations, they had time to simply be together. Albert taught Helena to ride properly on his gentle mare, patiently correcting her form while praising her natural courage and seat. Helena introduced him to her favorite walking paths through the countryside, shared her secret thinking spots, opened her inner world to him in ways that went beyond even their intimate letters. They talked for hours about everything and nothing, childhood memories, philosophical questions, hopes for their future together. Albert shared stories about his lonely youth, his difficult relationship with his demanding father, the weight of inheriting his title at 21 when he felt utterly unprepared. Helena told him about her mother's final days, her sister's marriage and subsequent distance, the particular loneliness of being needed but not truly known. These conversations, often held while walking through spring meadows or sitting in comfortable silence by the fire, created an intimacy that was different from their written correspondence but equally profound. They learned each other's habits and quirks, discovered compatibilities and minor irritations, practiced the mundane negotiations of sharing space and time. They also had their first real argument during this time. It began when Albert announced plans to purchase a London townhouse in Helena's name, ensuring she would have independent resources and property. His intentions were good. He wanted her to have security and autonomy, but Helena bristled at what felt like charity. "I'm not marrying you for your money," she said sharply, setting down her teacup with more force than necessary. "I don't need you to take care of me financially as if I were a kept woman rather than your wife." "That's not what this is," Albert protested, clearly surprised by her vehemence. "I'm trying to protect you, to make sure you're never dependent or powerless. It's a gift, Helena, not an insult." "But don't you see?" Helena countered, her frustration mounting. "By making these decisions without consulting me, you're already treating me as if I have no power, no voice. You're doing exactly what you said you wouldn't, using your position and resources to control the situation, to decide what's best for me without asking what I want." The accusation stung, and Albert's expression darkened. "I'm trying to be generous, to ensure your future security. Most women would be grateful for such consideration. Then perhaps you should have chosen one of those most women," Helena interrupted, her voice cold. "But you chose me, and I will not be managed or handled, even with the best intentions. I will not be treated like a child or a possession, however benevolently." They stood facing each other in the drawing room of Windsor Manor, both breathing hard, both realizing they had reached their first real impasse. The silence stretched between them, tense and uncomfortable. Helena could see the frustration in Albert's face, the struggle between his ingrained habits of command and his desire to honor her independence. Finally, Albert spoke, his voice quiet but strained. "You're right. I apologize. I fell back into the habit of making decisions unilaterally because that's what I've always done. My father taught me that a man's responsibility is to provide and protect, to make decisions for those under his care. But you're not under my care. You're my equal partner. You deserve to be consulted, to have equal say in matters that affect your life, our life." The admission cost him something. Helena could see it in the tightness around his eyes, the difficulty he had with yielding control. But he had done it anyway, had chosen their relationship over his pride and ingrained assumptions about how marriages should function. "I'm sorry too," Helena said, her anger dissipating as quickly as it had flared. "I know you meant well. I know generosity was your intention. But I'm just afraid of losing myself in all of this, of becoming merely the Duchess rather than Helena. I need to know that I'll still have agency, still have the right to disagree with you without being dismissed as ungrateful or difficult or unwomanly." "You will always have that right," Albert assured her, reaching for her hands cautiously, as if unsure of his welcome. "Always. And I promise to do better about consulting you, about making decisions together rather than for you. But you have to help me. Tell me when I'm overstepping. Remind me when I'm falling into old patterns. This is new for me, this kind of partnership. I've never been in a relationship where my decisions were questioned, where another person's preferences mattered as much as my own." "It's new for me too," Helena admitted, allowing him to take her hands. "I've been independent for so long, made all my own decisions without having to consider anyone else's needs or opinions. Learning to share that with someone else, to compromise and negotiate, it's harder than I expected. Sometimes I want you to simply understand what I need without my having to ask, but that's not fair to you." They worked through it together over several long conversations, ultimately deciding that the townhouse would be purchased jointly, that Helena would be involved in selecting and furnishing it, that major financial decisions would be made together. It was a small thing, perhaps, but it established a pattern for how they would handle future disagreements, with honesty, compromise, and mutual respect, rather than automatic deference or stubborn independence. The argument, difficult as it was, actually strengthened their relationship. It proved they could weather conflict, could speak honestly even when it created tension, could find their way back to each other after discord. It reminded them both that marriage would require constant negotiation, that love alone wasn't enough without communication and willingness to adapt. As spring arrived and Helena's period of mourning drew to a close, they began planning the wedding in earnest. Albert had assumed they would marry in London, in a grand ceremony befitting a duke's wedding, with hundreds of guests and all the elaborate ritual that society expected. But Helena had other ideas. "I want to marry here," she told him one April evening as they walked through the gardens of Winthor Manor, now bright with daffodils and early roses. The air smelled of rain and growing things, of possibility and renewal. "In the village church where my parents married, where my mother is buried, I want something intimate, personal, not a spectacle for society to dissect and criticize. I want to marry you surrounded by people who know us, who care about us as people, rather than as Duke and Duchess." Albert was quiet for a long moment, and Helena prepared herself for resistance. Surely he would insist on something grander, something appropriate to his station, something that would satisfy society's expectations and political connections. "I think that's perfect," he said finally, surprising her completely. "I would love nothing more than to marry you surrounded by people who actually care about us, in a place that has meaning for you. Society can attend our reception in London afterward if they must, but the ceremony itself should be ours alone. I'm tired of performing for audiences who don't matter." The relief Helena felt was profound. "You're certain? I know there will be criticism, that people will say it's inappropriate, or that I'm preventing you from having the wedding your position deserves." "Let them say whatever they like," Albert interrupted firmly. "This is our wedding, our marriage, our life. We start as we mean to continue, making choices that honor what matters to us rather than what society expects. If that makes us unconventional, so be it." The wedding was set for early June, giving them time to arrange everything properly, while keeping the guest list deliberately small. Helena invited only people who truly mattered to her: Mrs. Pemberton and the household staff who had become family, a few genuine friends from the neighborhood, her sister and brother-in-law traveling from London, the vicar who had known her since childhood. Albert invited his closest friend from university, his solicitor, who had become more confidant than employee, a handful of relatives who had shown him genuine affection rather than mere deference to his title, and a few political allies who had become true friends. The preparations were simpler than they would have been for a grand London wedding, but no less meaningful. Helena chose her dress with care, ivory silk, elegant but not ostentatious, with delicate embroidery that her mother would have loved. She decided to carry roses from the garden, the same variety her mother had planted decades ago. Mrs. Pemberton insisted on personally overseeing every detail of the wedding breakfast, determined that even a small celebration should be perfect. Albert spent the weeks before the wedding handling the practical matters of combining their lives, arranging for Helena's belongings to be moved to his primary estate, settling her father's debts, and ensuring Winthor Manor would be maintained as a retreat for them, establishing accounts and ensuring she had immediate access to funds. He also commissioned a portrait of Sir Geoffrey to hang in their home, wanting Helena to have her father's presence in her new life. The night before the wedding, Helena stood in her chamber at Winthor Manor for what would be the last time as an unmarried woman. Tomorrow she would become a duchess, would leave this house that had been her entire world for 26 years. The enormity of it suddenly overwhelmed her, and she found herself weeping, not from regret, but from the sheer magnitude of the transformation, from the bittersweet mixture of endings and beginnings. A soft knock came at her door. "Helena, may I come in?" She recognized Albert's voice and quickly dried her tears. "You're not supposed to see me the night before the wedding. It's bad luck." "Then we'll start our marriage by defying superstition," he said, entering despite her weak protest. He took in her tear-stained face and moved to her immediately, his formal evening clothes suggesting he had just come from dining with the wedding guests staying at a nearby inn. "What's wrong? Are you having second thoughts?" "No," she said quickly, then more honestly. "Not about you, about everything else. I keep thinking about my mother, wishing she could be here tomorrow to see this. And about my father. How he'll miss walking me down the aisle, how he wanted this for me but won't see it happen. About how much my life is about to change, how I'll never again be just Helena Winthor, invisible and ordinary and safe. I'm afraid I'll disappoint you, that I won't be the Duchess you need me to be, that I'll embarrass you or make mistakes that reflect badly on your family name." Albert guided her to sit on the edge of her bed, settling beside her with a familiarity that would have been shocking mere months ago but now felt natural. "May I tell you something? I'm terrified too. Terrified that marriage will change what we have. That the weight of being a duchess will crush the spirit I fell in love with. That you'll wake up one day and resent me for pulling you into this life. I'm afraid that I'll fail you the way my father failed my mother. That I'll become so consumed by duty and position that I'll forget the man you agreed to marry. I'm afraid that society's judgment will wound you in ways I can't protect you from." "Just all right?" Helena asked, finding a small smile despite her tears. "Better than all right," he amended, returning her smile. "Extraordinary, actually, because we're not starting from the usual place, arranged convenience or surface attraction or family alliances. We started with words and honesty and real understanding. That's a stronger foundation than most marriages ever get. We've already weathered deception and revelation, disagreement and compromise. We've tested our connection and found it resilient." He pulled something from his pocket, a folded letter worn at the edges from repeated handling. "I've carried this with me since you sent it," he said, handing it to her. "It's the first letter you wrote back to me, where you said my letters had awakened longings you thought you'd buried. I read it whenever I need to remember why I took the risk of revealing myself, why I was willing to face your anger and potential rejection. It reminds me that this, us, is worth any difficulty we might face." Helena unfolded the letter, seeing her own handwriting from months ago, remembering the fear and hope she'd felt writing those words. Her hand had trembled as she wrote, uncertain whether she was being brave or foolish. "I was so afraid when I sent this," she admitted, "afraid of being vulnerable, of wanting something, of hoping for more than my quiet, predetermined life. I almost didn't send it. I wrote it and sealed it and nearly threw it into the fire 3 times before finally giving it to Mrs. Pemberton. "I'm grateful you were braver than your fear," Albert said softly. "And look how much courage it took to write those words, to take that risk. You're still that brave, Helena. You're just facing a different kind of risk now, the risk of happiness, of building something real with me, of stepping into an unknown future. And I promise you, I will spend every day of our marriage trying to be worthy of the trust you're placing in me. I will never take for granted what you're giving up, what you're risking, what you're choosing." They sat together in comfortable silence, her head on his shoulder, both taking comfort from the other's presence. Outside, the June evening stretched long and lovely, the last light touching the gardens with gold. Inside this small room where Helena had spent so many nights alone, they found themselves on the threshold of a new life that would transform them both. Finally, Albert stood reluctantly. "I should go before Mrs. Pemberton discovers me here and refuses to let me near you tomorrow out of propriety's sake. But Helena—" He paused at the door, his expression serious and tender. "Whatever happens tomorrow, whatever challenges we face as Duke and Duchess, never forget that you're choosing to marry Albert first. The man who writes letters about loneliness and music, who values honesty above propriety, who fell in love with a woman brave enough to be herself. That man will always be here beneath the title and expectations, always. I promise you that." After he left, Helena reread the letter he had carried with him, touched by the evidence that their written correspondence had meant as much to him as it had to her. She tucked it carefully into the small trunk of personal items she would take to her new life, wanting to keep that tangible reminder of where they had begun. Then she took out her own collection of his letters, dozens of them now, chronicling the evolution of their relationship from anonymous curiosity to deep love, and read through them one final time as Helena Winthor. Tomorrow she would be Helena Fairley, Duchess of Harrington. But tonight, in this quiet room, she was simply herself, a woman who had dared to hope, to risk, to choose love over safety. And that woman, she realized, would not disappear tomorrow. That woman would simply grow, expand, become more than she had been while remaining fundamentally herself. The wedding day dawned bright and clear, the June morning perfect in every way. Helena, dressed in her ivory silk gown, her dark hair arranged with fresh flowers from the garden her mother had planted years ago. Mrs. Pemberton wept openly as she helped with the final preparations, equal parts joy and sorrow at seeing her young mistress leave, at witnessing the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. "You look beautiful, Miss Helena," the housekeeper said, her voice thick with emotion. "Your mother would be so proud, your father too. They'd both be so happy to see you loved like this." The village church was small and ancient, its stone walls holding centuries of marriages and christenings and farewells. Helena walked down the aisle alone, her choice a statement that she came to this marriage as her own woman rather than being given away like property from father to husband. Some in the small congregation murmured at this unconventional choice, but Helena held her head high, her eyes fixed on Albert, who stood at the altar watching her approach. The expression on his face made her breath catch. There was no ducal reserve there, no practiced composure or aristocratic distance, only raw emotion, love and awe and gratitude so visible it made her eyes sting with tears. He looked at her as if she were the only person in the world, as if this small country church were the grandest cathedral and she the most precious treasure. The ceremony was simple and heartfelt. They spoke traditional vows but added their own words, promises of honesty and partnership, acknowledgement of the challenges ahead, commitment to choosing each other daily rather than assuming love was enough. When Albert slipped the ring on her finger, Helena felt the weight of it both literally and symbolically. She was a duchess now, but more importantly, she was his wife, his partner, his equal in all the ways that truly mattered. "I promise to always see you truly," Albert said, departing from the traditional vows, "to honor the woman you are, not just the title you'll carry, to build our life together rather than expecting you to simply fit into mine." "I promise to trust you even when it's difficult," Helena responded. "To speak honestly even when silence would be easier. To be brave enough to keep choosing you, keep choosing us every day. The kiss that sealed their vows was tender and filled with promise, with the joy of finally reaching this moment after so much uncertainty. The small congregation applauded warmly, genuinely happy for the couple who had defied convention to find each other. The reception at Winthor Manor was intimate and joyful. There were no elaborate speeches or formal presentations, just good food and genuine celebration among people who truly cared for the couple. Albert danced with Helena in the garden where he had first decided to write to her, where their story had truly begun months before they actually met. The June afternoon was warm and perfect, the roses in full bloom, the air sweet with summer. "What are you thinking?" he asked as they swayed together, the late afternoon sun gilding everything golden. "That I'm happy," Helena said simply. "Genuinely, terrifyingly happy. And that I'm grateful you were brave enough to write that first letter, to take the risk of being known. I'm grateful that you saw me that morning by the bridge and didn't simply ride away. I'm grateful for every choice that led us to this moment." "I'm grateful you were brave enough to write back," he countered, "to trust someone you'd never met, to open your heart despite every reason to be cautious. We've both been brave, Helena, and we'll need to keep being brave as we navigate what comes next. But I believe we can face anything together that we couldn't face alone." What came next was both easier and harder than either had anticipated. The London season brought the scrutiny Albert had warned about, but Helena discovered reserves of strength and grace she hadn't known she possessed. She learned to navigate society's intricate rules, to deflect rudeness with dignity, to identify genuine friends among the opportunists. Albert's world became less foreign, and she found her place within it, not by changing herself, but by remaining authentically herself and letting those who truly mattered recognize her worth. There were still difficult moments, a particularly vicious gossip column that questioned Helena's suitability and breeding, suggesting that the Duke had married beneath himself out of some temporary madness. An encounter with Albert's former fiancée at a ball, where the elegant Lady Caroline made cutting remarks about Helena's humble origins and lack of social polish. A dinner party where she committed a minor faux pas regarding precedence that was magnified by those watching for any sign of inadequacy. Each incident stung, each reminder of her outsider status cut deeply. But they faced each challenge together, Albert's steady support and Helena's resilient strength, creating a partnership that proved stronger than society's judgment. When the gossip wounded her, he held her and reminded her of her worth. When she doubted her ability to navigate his world, he pointed out how far she'd already come, how many people genuinely liked and respected her. And slowly, gradually, Helena built her own identity as Duchess, not trying to be someone she wasn't, but finding ways to use her position for good while remaining true to herself. They also maintained the practice that had started their relationship, writing letters to each other. Even when they were in the same house, they would occasionally leave notes for each other, continuing the intimate written conversation that had first connected them. These letters became a private language, a way of staying honest and vulnerable, even when the demands of their public roles threatened to overshadow their personal connection. Sometimes the notes were playful, sometimes serious, sometimes simply expressions of love that were easier to write than speak aloud. 1 year after their wedding, Helena discovered she was pregnant. The news brought joy mixed with anxiety. She worried about becoming a mother, about raising a child in the spotlight of their position, about whether she could balance all the roles she now held. But Albert's response reminded her why she had chosen him. "We'll figure it out together," he said, his hand on her still flat stomach, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "Just like we've figured out everything else. And our child will grow up knowing that love and honesty matter more than titles, that authenticity is more valuable than propriety. We'll teach them what we learned from each other, that being truly seen and choosing to be vulnerable is the bravest thing a person can do." Their son was born the following spring, a healthy boy they named Geoffrey Albert, honoring Helena's father and claiming Albert's name for the child who would one day inherit his title. Helena took to motherhood with the same mixture of determination and uncertainty she had brought to becoming a duchess. There were moments of doubt, times when she felt overwhelmed by the responsibility of shaping another life. But Albert was an involved, devoted father. breaking with aristocratic tradition by actually spending time with his son, rather than relegating childcare entirely to nurses and governesses. On a crisp October evening, almost exactly 2 years after Helena had received that first anonymous letter, she sat in the music room of their London townhouse, playing the Moonlight Sonata. Albert sat nearby, ostensibly reading, but really just keeping her company as he often did. Their infant son slept peacefully in his cradle beside the piano, oblivious to the music that had played such a role in his parents' love story. As the final notes faded, Helena looked at her husband and her child, at the life they had built from letters and risk, and choosing each other despite impossible odds. She thought about the woman she had been, lonely, resigned, convinced her life was essentially over at 26, and she thought about the woman she had become, still herself, still flawed and uncertain sometimes, but transformed by being fully known and completely loved. "What are you thinking?" Albert asked, using the question that had become their shorthand for deeper conversation, for accessing the honesty that had always been their foundation. "That I'm grateful," Helena said, her voice soft with emotion. "For your letters, for your courage, for the life we've built, for the risk you took in trying to be known as just Albert rather than the Duke of Harrington. For choosing me when you could have chosen anyone, when society expected you to choose someone more appropriate, more polished, more everything that I'm not." He smiled, that unguarded expression she now saw regularly, that told her more than words ever could. "And I'm grateful you saw past the deception to the heart of what I was trying to do, that you gave me a chance to prove that the man in the letters was real, that you were brave enough to build a life with me despite all the reasons it seemed impossible." "He was real," Helena confirmed, moving to sit beside him, their son sleeping peacefully nearby. "He is real, and I choose him every day, the Duke and the man, the title and the person, all of it together because they're inseparable in you. Just as I'm both Helena and the Duchess, both the quiet countrywoman and whoever I'm becoming in this new life. Both versions of myself existing together, neither one negating the other." Their son stirred in his cradle, making the small sounds that preceded waking. Albert moved to pick him up, cradling the baby with practiced ease that still sometimes surprised Helena. This powerful duke who could be so gentle with their tiny son. "And what shall we teach this young man about love and letters and taking risks?" "That sometimes the bravest thing you can do is be honest about who you are," Helena said, joining them. The three of them reflected in the window glass against the London evening. A family united not by convention but by choice. That real connection requires vulnerability, that love is a choice you make daily, not a feeling that simply happens to you. And that the best relationships begin with honesty and continue with choosing each other over and over despite all the complications. Albert kissed her temple, then their son's head. Wise words from a woman who was brave enough to fall in love with words on a page, trusting that the man behind them was worth the risk. "He was," Helena said simply, meeting her husband's eyes. "He is. Every day he is." As their son opened his eyes and looked between his parents with that unfocused wonder of the very young, Helena felt the truth of her words resonate through her entire being. The journey from that first mysterious letter to this moment had been complicated, sometimes painful, often challenging. But it had also been beautiful in ways she never could have imagined when she was a lonely spinster resigned to a narrow life. She had been loved not for what she could provide or how she appeared, but for who she truly was, quirks and flaws and all. And she had learned to love fully in return, not the fantasy of a mysterious correspondent, but the complex reality of a man who carried both privilege and burden, who had taken an enormous risk to find authentic connection, who chose every day to be vulnerable with her. Their story would become something of a legend in society. The Duke who courted his future wife through anonymous letters, the quiet country woman who became a beloved duchess. But the truth was simpler and more profound than any legend. Two lonely people had found each other through words, had chosen vulnerability over safety, had built something real in a world that too often valued appearance over authenticity. And every morning for the rest of their lives, when Helena woke beside Albert, she would remember that first letter, reaching across social divides and personal fear to simply say, "I see you, I understand you, I want to know you." And she would be grateful, over and over, that she had been brave enough to write back, brave enough to risk her heart, brave enough to choose love, even when it meant stepping into an unknown and frightening future. Dear listeners, thank you so much for joining us on Helena and Albert's journey from mysterious letters to enduring love. If this story touched your heart the way it touched ours in creating it, we would be so grateful if you could take a moment to subscribe to Echoes of Romance, leave us a comment sharing your thoughts about what resonated with you most, and hit that like button to help others discover these stories. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss a new tale of love, courage, and connection. Your support means the world to us and helps us continue bringing you these stories of people brave enough to choose authenticity and love. Until next time, may you always have the courage to be truly seen and the wisdom to recognize when someone sees you truly.